I've certainly uncovered a lot of episodes where Britain has been either involved in coups or has been involved in military interventions that have appalling impacts on people's lives that simply never get mentioned. They're never referred to in the newspapers. They never get on TV histories of Britain. They're just taken out, basically. They're deleted from our historical memory.
Why does the public in Britain have such little idea of the sheer scale of this?
Well, a very large reason for that is that, if you look at every war or every coup or every regime that Britain is supporting or been involved in, it's usually accompanied by an increasingly sophisticated public relations operation by the government. We're told that British foreign policy is based on promoting democracy, on spreading development and promoting human rights. Well, if you read the actual government planning files, planners are saying to themselves that their policy is not based on that. It's based on the control of oil. It's based on creating an international economy that works in the interests of British corporations. And it's based on maintaining their great power status. This culture of impunity is deeply embedded within British society. If you go back, say in the 1960s, a time when Britain was covertly supporting an Indonesian military that was killing up to 1 million people, where Britain was responsible for depopulating the Chagos Islands, and where Britain was arming the Nigerian government that was killing hundreds of thousands of Biafrans in the civil war in Nigeria. All of that was taking place under the Labour government in the 1960s. And none of those ministers have ever been questioned. And yet those decisions cost literally millions of lives.
The attack on Iraq did not begin with shock and awe. During the first Gulf War in 1991, Britain and America deliberately bombed Iraq's modern infrastructure. And when the war was over, the bombing continued. This was seldom reported. During this period of the 1990s, the UN imposed an economic blockade led by Britain and America. Essentials like clean water and vital drugs were denied. In 1998, the United Nations Children's Fund reported the deaths of 500,000 children under the age of 5, a direct result of the sanctions imposed by the blockade. This is Dennis Halliday, former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, who resigned after refusing to administer the sanctions. In 1999, I travelled with him to Iraq.
The very provisions of the Charter and the Declaration of Human Rights have been set aside. And we are waging a warfare through the United Nations on the children and people of Iraq with incredible results. Results that you do not expect to see in a war under the Geneva Conventions. We're targeting civilians, worse, we're targeting children like Safa, who of course were not born when Iraq went into Kuwait. What is this about? It's a monstrous situation for the United Nations, for the Western world, for all of us who are part of some democratic system, who are in fact responsible for the policies of our governments and the implementation of economic sanctions.
Khan Ross was a senior British diplomat at the UN responsible for imposing the embargo on Iraq. You gave evidence on the impact of sanctions.
Yes.
And this is what you said. The weight of evidence clearly indicates that sanctions caused massive human suffering among ordinary Iraqis, in particular children. We, the US and UK governments, were the primary engineers and defenders of sanctions and were well aware of this evidence at the time. But we largely ignored it or blamed all these effects on the Saddam government. Sanctions effectively denied the entire population the means to live, unquote. That's a shocking admission.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I stand by it today.
Why didn't you speak out during those 4.5 years?
There is a certain macho culture in foreign policy circles that to talk about things like humanitarian suffering when you're dealing with Saddam Hussein is a bit wet. That it's not what the issue is really about, that governments do security, that's the kind of hard thing that we're there to provide. And I think, however wrong your decisions may be, whatever damage you may do to other individuals, there is, at the end of the day, no accountability whatsoever. We had extraordinarily good resources to put together our story, to find little facts to justify their story, factoids I began to call them.
And how eagerly would journalists accept these factoids?
They had very little chance to do anything other than accept our version of events and more or less relay it unedited to the public. Government is an information machine, and we would control access for journalists to us, to governments. When I was in news department in the Foreign Office, we would control access to the Foreign Secretary as a form of reward to journalists if they were critical, if we felt they were too hostile to our account of events. We would not give them the goodies of trips with the Foreign Secretary around the world, or exclusive interviews every now and then. We did the same in New York. If journalists were not particularly supportive to our account, we would freeze them out. We would make life harder for them. But there is a subtle and private relationship between them, which is basically of favoritism, that certain journalists are rewarded with access for being supportive of the story. They will basically tell journalists, you carry on with that line, that kind of unjustified criticism of our government policy on X, Y, or Z, we will punish you. And that is very explicit, those kinds of threats. What happened was not an intelligence-based process. It was basically a PR process run by Number 10 to produce a document that was much more politically credible than the evidence suggested.
It was a major deception, wasn't it?
I think it amounts, in effect, to that, yes. I remember before I was sent to New York in late 97, I did the round of departments in London saying to them, OK, I'm going to New York, I'm going to be doing Iraq, what do I need to know? And I went to see non-proliferation department in the Foreign Office, and I was expecting a briefing on the vast piles of weapons that we still thought Iraq possessed. And the desk officer sort of looked at me slightly sheepishly and said, well, actually, we don't think there's anything. We don't think there's anything in Iraq. I said, that's extraordinary. I mean, I thought we had sanctions because we thought Iraq had large amounts of weapons. He said, no. The justification for sanctions is basically that we have unanswered questions about how those stocks were destroyed in the past. But what I feel very guilty about it. I feel very ashamed about it. I feel ashamed about it sitting talking to you. I feel actual shame running through my body when I talk to you about it.
Should journalists feel the same? Those who pass on the deception?
Absolutely. We should all be accountable to each other. I think that's the only way to have a civilized society, is some kind of transparency with each other and accountability, and people holding people morally accountable for what they do. And that applies to journalists as much as it applies to anybody.